Have you ever felt like God has forgotten your prayers? Like everyone around you is receiving their breakthrough while you're still waiting, still believing, still holding on to promises that seem to fade with each passing day? Here's what most Christians won't tell you. That delay you're experiencing isn't denial, it's divine preparation. Today, I'm revealing why your blessing isn't lost, but perfectly preserved in God's timing, waiting for the exact moment when it will transform not just your situation, but your entire understanding of His faithfulness. What if I told you that right now, in this very moment of waiting, God is orchestrating something far greater than what you originally asked for? The Bible shows us repeatedly that God's delays always lead to greater displays of His glory. From Abraham receiving Isaac to Jesus raising Lazarus on the fourth day instead of healing him on the first. This isn't another generic, just wait on God message. We're diving deep into the biblical blueprint that shows exactly how God uses timing to multiply your blessing, why He allows certain seasons of silence, and what's actually happening in the spiritual realm while you wait. Before we begin, comment, God's timing is perfect if you're trusting Him through a waiting season right now. Watch until the end. I promise the third revelation about Paul's thorn will completely shift your perspective on unanswered prayers. And if this message speaks to you, subscribe and join our community of believers who understand that delays are not denials. In this first part of our journey, we're going to explore what happens when God first plants a promise in someone's heart. We'll walk through 3 powerful stories from the Bible where God spoke incredible promises to ordinary people. But those promises took years, even decades, to come true. These aren't just ancient stories. They're blueprints for understanding how God works in our own lives today. The tent flap rustled in the desert wind as Abraham sat counting the stars scattered across the night sky. He was 75 years old when God's voice first broke through his ordinary life with an extraordinary promise. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abraham obeyed. He packed up everything he owned, took his wife Sarah, and stepped into the unknown. But there was one problem that grew heavier with each passing year. Sarah's womb remained empty. How could he become a great nation without even one child? Years crawled by like desert caravans crossing endless sand. Abraham turned 80, then 85. Sarah's hair turned gray, and her steps became slower. The promise seemed to mock them every morning they woke up childless. 10 years had passed since God first spoke, and still, no son. That's when Sarah had an idea that would complicate everything. In Genesis chapter 16, she came to Abraham with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Sarah's words revealed the pain hidden in her heart, as verse 2 records, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to his wife's plan. When Hagar became pregnant, the household erupted in conflict. The servant girl began to look down on her mistress, and Sarah's bitterness grew deeper. She treated Hagar so harshly that the pregnant woman fled into the desert. Though an angel sent her back, the damage was done. Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86, but this wasn't the promised child. This was the result of human impatience trying to help God fulfill His word. 13 more years of silence followed. Abraham was now 99 years old, his body as good as dead for producing children. That's when God appeared again, and their conversation in Genesis chapter 17 would change everything. Starting in verse 1, the Lord said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." Abraham fell face down, and God continued speaking in verses 4 through 6. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." But Abraham couldn't help himself. The waiting had been so long, the disappointments so many. In verse 17, we see his honest response. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Even Abraham's faith had limits. He suggested God work through Ishmael instead. But God's response in verses 19 through 21 was clear. "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." The next year arrived like all the others before it, except this time, everything was different. Genesis chapter 21 opens with 7 simple words that held 25 years of waiting. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Verse 2 continues, "Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him." Picture the scene. A 100-year-old man holding his newborn son, tears streaming down his weathered face. Sarah, at 90, nursing a baby when other women her age had great-grandchildren. The impossibility of it all made God's power unmistakable. Sarah's laughter in verse 6 wasn't mockery anymore, but pure joy. "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." She added in verse 7, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." What did those 25 years of waiting produce in Abraham? The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans chapter 4, verses 20 and 21, "Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised." The waiting wasn't wasted time. Every year that passed, every moment of doubt overcome, every temptation to give up that was resisted, it all refined Abraham's faith like fire refines gold. He learned that God's delays aren't because he's forgotten or unable. Sometimes he waits until the situation is so impossible that when he moves, no one can claim credit but him. While Abraham waited in tents under stars, another young man's story would unfold in the fields of Canaan. Joseph was 17 years old, tending his father's flocks with his brothers. He was the favored son, wearing a richly ornamented robe that his father Jacob had made especially for him. But God was about to drop 2 dreams into this teenager's heart that would take him on a 13-year journey through slavery and prison before they came true. Genesis chapter 37, verse 5, sets the stage. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. His dream was bold and seemed arrogant to his older brothers. he said to them in verses 6 and 7, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose, stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother's response was sharp and angry. Verse 8 records their words, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph wasn't finished. He had another dream, and this one was even bigger. In verse 9, he shared it. "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Even his father, who loved him dearly, rebuked him for this one." Jacob said in verse 10, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Yet, verse 11 tells us something important. While his brothers were jealous, his father kept the matter in mind. The dreams were from God, but the path to their fulfillment would be nothing like what Joseph imagined. Days later, his brothers saw him coming across the fields to check on them. Their hatred boiled over. Genesis chapter 37, verse 18, reveals their plot. "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They stripped off his beautiful robe, threw him into an empty cistern, and sat down to eat lunch while their 17-year-old brother cried out from the darkness below." When a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by, Judah had an idea. Verse 27 records his suggestion, "Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." For 20 pieces of silver, Joseph was sold. The favored son became property. The dreamer became a slave. As the trader's caravan disappeared into the distance toward Egypt, his brothers dipped his robe in goat's blood and returned home with a lie that would break their father's heart. In Egypt, Joseph was sold again, this time to Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. Genesis chapter 39, verse 2 tells us, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master." Even as a slave, Joseph's gift made room for him. Verses 3 and 4 continue. "When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned." Things were looking up. Maybe this was how God would fulfill the dreams. But then Potiphar's wife noticed the handsome young Hebrew slave. Day after day, she tried to seduce him. Joseph's response in verse 9 showed his character. "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" One day, when no one else was in the house, she grabbed his cloak and demanded he sleep with her. Joseph ran, leaving his garment in her hands. Her false accusation landed him in prison. The dreamer went from the pit to slavery, and now from slavery to prison. He was farther from his dreams than ever. But even in prison, God's hand was on Joseph. Genesis chapter 39, verses 21 through 23 tell us, "The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. 2 years passed in that prison. Then Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were thrown into the same jail. Both had dreams they couldn't understand. When Joseph interpreted them correctly, the cupbearer would be restored, the baker would be executed. He asked the cupbearer in Genesis chapter 40, verse 14, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." The cupbearer was restored, just as Joseph said. But verse 23 delivers a crushing blow. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. 2 more years passed. Joseph was now 30 years old. 13 years had gone by since his brothers sold him. 13 years of slavery and imprisonment. 13 years of holding on to dreams that seemed more like mockery than promise. Then Pharaoh had dreams that troubled all of Egypt. No one could interpret them until the cupbearer finally remembered the Hebrew prisoner. In a single day, everything changed. Joseph was brought from the dungeon, cleaned up, and stood before the most powerful man in the known world. When he correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dreams about 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, Pharaoh's response in Genesis chapter 41, verses 39 through 41, was stunning. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. In one moment, Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister. The dreams weren't dead. They were being positioned. When his brothers came to Egypt during the famine and bowed before him, not recognizing the powerful Egyptian official as their little brother, the dreams from 13 years earlier were fulfilled exactly as God had shown. But the most powerful moment comes in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, when Joseph revealed the truth to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Every betrayal, every false accusation, every forgotten promise, God was using it all. The pit wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The prison wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Those 13 years weren't wasted, they were working. Joseph needed the pit to learn dependence, slavery to learn service, and prison to learn patience. By the time he stood before Pharaoh, he was ready. The prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with a horn of oil and a heavy heart. God had rejected Saul as king of Israel, and now Samuel was sent to anoint the next king from among Jesse's sons. But this anointing would begin a journey unlike any other. A young shepherd boy would be chosen by God, but hunted by man for years before claiming his throne. 1 Samuel chapter 16 opens with God's instructions to Samuel in verse 1. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Samuel was afraid. If Saul heard about this secret anointing, he would kill him. But God provided a cover story. Samuel would go to offer a sacrifice and invite Jesse's family. When Jesse's sons began passing before the prophet, Samuel was sure he'd found God's choice. Verse 6 records his thoughts when he saw Eliab. Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But God's response in verse 7 would echo through history. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 7 sons passed before Samuel. 7 rejections. Confused, Samuel asked Jesse in verse 11, Are these all the sons you have? Jesse's answer revealed how little anyone thought of the youngest. There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep. They hadn't even bothered to bring him to the sacrifice. But Samuel insisted, Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. When David walked in from the fields, probably smelling like sheep and covered in dust, God's voice was clear. Verse 12 tells us, Then the Lord said, Rise and anoint him. This is the one. In front of his brothers who overlooked him, in front of his father who forgot to invite him, Samuel poured oil over the shepherd boy's head. Verse 13 describes what happened next. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. But David didn't go to a palace that day. He went back to the sheep. The anointing was real, but the throne was distant. In fact, his first introduction to royal life wasn't as king, but as a musician to soothe Saul's troubled spirit. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 21 tells us, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers. The shepherd boy was now serving the very king he was anointed to replace. Saul had no idea that the young man playing the harp to calm his demons was the one God had chosen to take his throne. David could have seen this as his opportunity. He was close to the king, trusted, armed. But David understood something crucial. God's anointing doesn't mean man's timing. Everything changed after David killed Goliath. The women's songs in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7, ignited Saul's jealousy. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. From that moment, verse 9 says, and from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The king who once loved David now hunted him. Multiple times, Saul hurled spears at David while he played the harp. David had to flee for his life, leaving behind his position, his family, and his best friend, Jonathan. The anointed future king became a fugitive, living in caves and wilderness. For years, David ran. He hid in the desert of Ziph, the strongholds of En-Gedi, the forest of Hereth. He pretended to be insane before the Philistine king. He lived among Israel's enemies. Men who were in distress, in debt, and discontented gathered to him, about 400 social outcasts who became his mighty men. Twice, God delivered Saul into David's hands. The first time was in a cave at En-Gedi. Saul came in alone to relieve himself, not knowing David and his men were hidden in the back. David's men whispered that this was God giving him the kingdom. But 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 6, shows David's heart. The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. David cut off a corner of Saul's robe to prove he could have killed him, but didn't. When he called out to Saul from a safe distance, showing the piece of cloth, even Saul was moved. In verse 20, Saul admitted, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. But the hunting continued. Years passed. David grew weary. Some of his most beautiful psalms were written in these dark caves and desperate nights. Psalm 27, verse 14, captures his heart during this time. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. David could have forced God's promise. He had opportunities to kill Saul. He had men who would have fought for him. The people loved him more than Saul. But David understood that forcing God's timing would pollute God's blessing. He would rather live in caves with God's approval than in palaces with blood on his hands. When news finally came that Saul had died in battle, David's response shocked everyone. Instead of celebrating, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 12 tells us, they mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David even executed the man who claimed to have killed Saul, saying in verse 14, Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? This wasn't political calculation. This was a heart that had learned to wait for God's timing, even when man's opportunity presented itself. David was 30 years old when he finally became king, first over Judah, then over all Israel. The shepherd boy was probably around 15 when Samuel anointed him. That's 15 years of waiting, running, hiding, and holding on to a promise while being hunted by the very throne he was promised. But those years weren't wasted. In the sheep fields, David learned to protect the vulnerable. Fighting lions and bears prepared him for Goliath. Playing the harp for Saul taught him the burden of leadership. Living as a fugitive showed him dependence on God. Leading outcasts prepared him to unite a nation. Every cave was a classroom. Every close call was building character. The man who finally sat on Israel's throne wasn't the same boy Samuel anointed. He was weathered by waiting, strengthened by suffering, and refined by resistance. He had learned the secret that would make him Israel's greatest king, that God's promises are certain, but they unfold in God's timing, not ours. Now we move into the middle of the story, that difficult space between receiving a promise and seeing it fulfilled. This is where most of us live our daily lives, in the wilderness between what God said and what we see. We're going to explore 3 different wilderness experiences from the Bible that show us what God is actually doing when it feels like nothing is happening. These aren't just delays, they're divine processes that prepare us for what's coming. The math didn't make sense. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2 states a simple fact that would haunt an entire generation. It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road. 11 days. That's all the time needed to walk from Mount Sinai, where they received the law, to the edge of the Promised Land. Less than 2 weeks of walking, and they would have been home. But those 11 days stretched into 40 years. The Israelites had left Egypt with mighty miracles fresh in their memory. They'd walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. They'd watched Pharaoh's army drown behind them. They'd seen the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. God's presence was visible, tangible, undeniable. Yet when 12 spies went into the Promised Land to scout it out, 10 came back terrified. Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 through 33, records their report that poisoned a nation's faith. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Only Joshua and Caleb believed God could give them victory. The people's response was to weep all night and plan to stone Moses and return to Egypt. That's when God made his declaration in Numbers chapter 14, verses 28 through 30. As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. The judgment continued in verses 33 and 34. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. So began the longest detour in history. A journey of days became decades. But God wasn't just punishing, he was preparing. That rebellious, enslaved generation needed to die, but more importantly, a new generation needed to be born and shaped. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, reveals what God was really doing in those 40 years. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man doesn't live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Every morning for 40 years, something extraordinary happened. Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, describes God's plan. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. Picture it. 2 million people waking up every morning to find the ground covered with small white flakes that looked like frost. Exodus chapter 16, verse 31, tells us, "The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. They couldn't store it. If they tried to keep extra for tomorrow, except on the Sabbath, it would rot and fill with maggots. Every single day they had to trust God for that day's provision. No savings account, no backup plan, no pantry full of food, just daily dependence on heaven's supply. The wilderness wasn't just about getting from Egypt to Canaan. It was about getting Egypt out of them and God into them. They'd been slaves for 400 years. They knew how to make bricks, not war. They knew how to follow Pharaoh's orders, not God's presence. They needed to learn a completely new way of living. In the wilderness, they learned to follow a cloud. When it moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. Numbers chapter 9, verses 17 and 18 describe this divine GPS system. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Sometimes the cloud stayed for days, sometimes for months. Verse 22 says, "Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days, or a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out." They couldn't make plans. They couldn't control the schedule. They had to learn moment-by-moment obedience. The wilderness taught them about God's justice, too. When Korah rebelled, the earth opened and swallowed him. When they complained about the manna, God sent poisonous snakes. When they grumbled about water, Moses struck the rock. Every lesson was immediate, visible, unforgettable. But the wilderness also revealed God's mercy. Their clothes didn't wear out for 40 years. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 5, records Moses reminding them, "During the 40 years that I led you through the wilderness, your clothes did not wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet." Their feet didn't swell despite all the walking. Water came from rocks. Manna fell from heaven. Quail covered the camp when they wanted meat. The children who entered the promised land were different from their parents who left Egypt. They'd never known slavery. They'd only known supernatural provision. They'd grown up seeing miracles as normal. They'd learned to fight, defeating the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Midianites. They'd learned to worship, building and moving the tabernacle, offering sacrifices, celebrating feasts. When this new generation finally stood at the Jordan River, they were ready. 40 years of wilderness had transformed a mob of slaves into a nation of warriors. 40 years of manna had taught them to trust God for everything. 40 years of following the cloud had taught them to move at God's command. Joshua chapter 3 tells how they crossed the Jordan at flood stage, the waters piling up as the priests' feet touched the river. This generation didn't hesitate like their parents at the Red Sea. They'd learned in the wilderness that when God says move, you move. When God says stand, you stand. When God provides, you gather. When God fights, you win. Back in the time of the judges, in the hill country of Ephraim, lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives. This arrangement, common in those days, would become the crucible for one of the Bible's most powerful stories of persistent prayer. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 2 introduces the tension immediately. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, the family would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice at the Lord's house. It should have been a joyful time, but for Hannah, these trips were torture. Verses 4 through 5 paint the painful picture. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. The double portion was Elkanah's way of showing Hannah extra love, trying to make up for what she lacked. But Peninnah saw it differently. She saw an opportunity. Verses 6 and 7 reveal the cruelty. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Imagine it. The one place that should bring comfort, God's house, became Hannah's place of deepest pain. Peninnah would choose that sacred time to whisper cruel words, to parade her children, to remind Hannah of her emptiness. And this didn't happen once. The Bible says year after year. Hannah's barrenness wasn't a brief trial. It was a long, grinding anguish. Elkanah tried to comfort her, asking in verse 8, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" He meant well, but he didn't understand. This wasn't about having a husband's love. This was about carrying a burden that only God could lift. One year, something broke inside Hannah. After they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, she couldn't take it anymore. Verse 10 describes her desperation. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. This wasn't a calm, collected prayer. This was a soul hemorrhaging before God. She made a vow that would change history. Verse 11 records her words. "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Hannah wasn't just asking for a son to keep. She was asking for a son to give away. She wanted a child so desperately that she was willing to have him only to dedicate him back to God. That's how deep her anguish ran. She'd rather be a mother who gives her child to God's service than not be a mother at all. As she kept praying, her lips moved but no sound came out. She was praying in her heart, pouring out years of accumulated grief. Eli the priest, watching from his seat by the doorpost, completely misread the situation. Verse 13 and 14 show his mistake. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." Even the priest didn't understand her pain, but Hannah's response in verses 15 and 16 reveals the depth of her struggle. "Not so, my lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Something in her words touched Eli. His response in verse 17 became the turning point. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah left different than she came. Verse 18 says, "She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Nothing had changed in her circumstances, but everything had changed in her heart. She'd poured out years of pain before God and received a word of hope from his priest. The very next verse, verse 19, tells us, "Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife, Hannah, and the Lord remembered her." That phrase, "the Lord remembered her," doesn't mean God had forgotten. It means the time had finally come. Verse 20 continues, "So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, 'Because I asked the Lord for him.'" But Hannah's story doesn't end with getting what she wanted. True to her vow, when Samuel was weaned, probably around age 3, she brought him to Eli at Shiloh. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 27 and 28, record her words, "I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." She left her only son, the child she'd wept years to have, at the temple. Every year she would make him a little robe and bring it when the family came to sacrifice. She would see him growing, serving in the temple, but he wouldn't come home with her. Yet God had more planned for Hannah than she could have imagined. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 21 tells us, "And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord." The woman who had been barren, mocked, and misunderstood became the mother of 6 children. But more than that, her Samuel became one of Israel's greatest prophets, the man who would anoint kings and guide a nation. Her years of barrenness weren't meaningless suffering. They were producing a desperation that would birth a dedication that would produce a prophet who would change history. The other children were blessings, but Samuel was destiny. He was worth every tear Hannah cried, every taunt she endured, every prayer she prayed. Sometimes God withholds good gifts, not because he's cruel, but because he's preparing something better than we're asking for. Between Friday's darkness and Sunday's dawn lies the most overlooked day in history, Saturday, the day between death and resurrection. For Jesus' disciples, this was the longest day of their lives, when everything they believed had died on a Roman cross and the resurrection hadn't yet come. Friday had been brutal. The Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, tells us some disciples watched from the foot of the cross. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." They watched him suffer for 6 hours. They heard him cry out, as Matthew chapter 27, verse 46 records. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They saw him breathe his last. John chapter 19, verse 30, preserves his final words. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The earth shook, the sky went dark, the temple veil tore from top to bottom. Their master, the one they believed was the Messiah, was dead. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took the body, wrapped it in spices and linen, and laid it in a tomb. Matthew chapter 27, verse 60, tells us Joseph rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. That stone sealed more than a tomb. It sealed their hopes. Saturday came with a deafening silence. The Sabbath meant they couldn't even process their grief through activity. They had to sit with their sorrow. Luke chapter 23, verse 56 simply says, "Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes." But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Think about what was racing through their minds. For 3 years, they'd left everything to follow Jesus. They'd watched him walk on water, multiply bread, raise the dead. Just days earlier, they'd entered Jerusalem to crowds shouting, "Hosanna!" They thought the kingdom was finally coming. Peter must have replayed his denial over and over. The rooster's crow would haunt him forever. John remembered Jesus entrusting Mary to his care. Why would the Messiah need someone else to care for his mother? Thomas, the skeptic, probably felt his doubts confirmed. They'd all argued about who would be greatest in the kingdom. Now there was no kingdom. Luke chapter 24, verse 21, captures their devastation. When the resurrected Jesus, whom they didn't recognize, met 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus on Sunday, they told him, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, and what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place." We had hoped, past tense. Their hope had died with Jesus. Saturday was filled with questions without answers. Why didn't he come down from the cross? He'd saved others. Why couldn't he save himself? Was John the Baptist wrong when he declared Jesus the Lamb of God? Were the Pharisees right all along? Had they wasted 3 years following a false prophet? John chapter 20, verse 19, tells us where they spent their Saturday night, bleeding into Sunday. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were hiding, doors locked, terrified they'd be next. If the authorities crucified Jesus, what would they do to his followers? Every footstep outside made them freeze. Every voice in the street could be soldiers coming for them. But while they sat in fear and confusion, God was working in ways they couldn't see. Saturday looked like defeat, but it was actually the day death was being defeated. The tomb was sealed, but Jesus was somewhere else entirely. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and 19 give us a glimpse. "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit." After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. While the disciples mourned, Jesus was proclaiming victory in the spiritual realm. While they questioned everything, he was conquering death itself. Their worst day was actually the day everything changed. They just couldn't see it yet. Early Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb with spices to properly care for Jesus' body. They were still living in Saturday's grief, planning to minister to a corpse. Mark chapter 16, verse 3 shows their practical concern. "And they asked each other, 'Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?' But verse 4 continues, "But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away." Everything changed in that moment. The angel's message in Matthew chapter 28, verses 5 and 6, shattered Saturday's sorrow. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said." When Jesus appeared to the disciples, he didn't condemn them for their doubt or fear. Instead, John chapter 20, verse 20 says, "After he said this, he showed them his hands and side." The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Their Saturday of sorrow made Sunday's joy even greater. Later, on the road to Emmaus, something beautiful happened. As the disguised Jesus walked with two heartbroken disciples, he explained everything. Luke chapter 24, verses 25 through 27, records, "He said to them, 'How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things, and then enter his glory?' And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. When he broke bread with them, verse 31 says, 'Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight.'" Their response in verse 32 reveals what Saturday had done. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Saturday's confusion had prepared them for Sunday's revelation. The darkness made them desperate for light. The questions made them ready for answers. The death of their expectations made room for resurrection reality. They thought Saturday was the end of the story, but it was just the pause before the greatest plot twist in history. Every disciple would face their own Saturdays throughout their lives. Times when God seemed silent, promises seemed broken, and hope seemed foolish. But they would remember this Saturday, when the worst day turned out to be the necessary prelude to the best day. They learned that God's silence doesn't mean God's absence. The tomb might be sealed, but resurrection is coming. We've reached the moment when God's timing finally reveals itself. This final part shows us what happens when the waiting ends, and God moves in ways that exceed everything we imagined. We'll witness three different manifestations of God's perfect timing, each one showing that what God ultimately gives is far greater than what we originally asked for. These aren't just answered prayers. They're testimonies of how God uses time itself to multiply his blessings. In the land of Uz lived a man whose story would become the ultimate test case for faith under fire. Job was blameless and upright, feared God, and shunned evil. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. Job chapter 1, verse 3 declares, "He was the greatest man among all the people of the East." But in heaven's throne room, a conversation took place that Job knew nothing about. Satan appeared before God, and the Lord asked him in Job chapter 1, verse 8, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Satan's response in verses 9 through 11 challenged the very nature of faith. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. God permitted the test, with one boundary: Satan couldn't touch Job himself. In a single day, 4 messengers brought news that destroyed Job's world. The Sabaeans stole his oxen and donkeys, killing the servants. Fire from heaven burned up his sheep and shepherds. The Chaldeans took his camels and killed more servants. Then the worst news came last. A mighty wind struck the house where his children were feasting, and all 10 of them died. Job's response in verses 20 and 21 stunned both heaven and hell. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Satan wasn't satisfied. He appeared before God again, and this time received permission to touch Job's body, but not take his life. Satan afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job sat in ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery. His wife's advice in chapter 2, verse 9, was brutal. "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job replied in verse 10, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Then came his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. For 7 days they sat in silence with him. When they finally spoke, their comfort turned to accusation. They insisted Job must have sinned terribly to deserve such punishment. Chapter after chapter records their debates, their theories, their attempts to explain suffering through simple formulas of cause and effect. Job maintained his innocence while struggling to understand. In chapter 13, verse 15, he declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." But he also cried out in chapter 23, verses 8 and 9, "But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him." Job wanted an audience with God. He wanted to present his case, to understand why this happened. His friends kept talking about God, explaining God, defending God. But Job wanted to hear from God himself. Finally, God spoke. Out of a whirlwind, the Creator answered Job, but not with explanations. Instead, God asked questions. Chapter 38, verses 4 through 7, began the divine interrogation. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" For 4 chapters, God took Job on a tour of creation, from the depths of the sea to the heights of the heavens, from the wild donkey to the mighty Leviathan. God never explained why Job suffered. He never mentioned Satan's challenge. He simply revealed himself, his power, his wisdom, his sovereignty over all creation. Job's response in chapter 42, verse 5, marked the turning point. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." This wasn't about getting answers anymore. It was about encountering the answerer. Job had moved from second-hand knowledge to first-hand experience, from theology to encounter, from knowing about God to seeing Him. Then came the restoration, triggered by an unexpected requirement. God told Job's friends in chapter 42, verse 8, "So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly." The very friends who had accused Job now needed his prayers. The man who had lost everything became the intercessor for those who had added to his pain. Verse 10 reveals the moment everything changed. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Notice the timing. After Job prayed for his friends, not after he suffered enough, not after he proved his faithfulness, but after he blessed those who had hurt him. Forgiveness unlocked restoration. The numbers are staggering. Verses 12 and 13 detail the doubling. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Everything doubled except his children. He had 10 before, 10 after. Why? Because his first children weren't lost. They were in eternity. Job didn't need 20 children. He had 20, just in 2 locations. Job's daughters received special mention. Verses 14 and 15 say, The first daughter he named Jemima, the second Kezia, and the third Keren-Happuch. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. In a culture where daughters rarely received inheritance, Job gave his daughters equal shares with their sons. His suffering had changed how he saw everything, including traditional customs. Grace makes us generous in unexpected ways. Job lived another 140 years after his restoration, seeing his children and their children to the fourth generation. Verse 17 concludes, "And so Job died, an old man and full of years." The man who lost everything discovered that losing everything wasn't losing God's plan. It was entering deeper into it. His possessions were doubled, but more importantly, his knowledge of God was transformed. He could have lived with half the sheep if it meant seeing God's face. The external restoration was wonderful, but the internal transformation was priceless. In the village of Bethany, just 2 miles from Jerusalem, lived 3 siblings who were among Jesus' closest friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. When Lazarus became seriously ill, the sisters sent an urgent message to Jesus. John chapter 11, verse 3, records their simple plea, "Lord, the one you love is sick." They didn't ask him to come. They didn't tell him what to do. They just informed him of the need, confident that love would motivate action. They knew Jesus had healed strangers. Surely he would rush to heal his friend. But Jesus' response in verse 4 seemed oddly detached. "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." The next statement, in verses 5 and 6, contains a paradox that would haunt the sisters. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Because he loved them, he delayed. Not in spite of his love, but because of it. Love sometimes waits when rushing would rob us of a greater miracle. By the time Jesus announced to his disciples that they were going to Judea, the situation had changed. In verse 14, Jesus stated plainly, "Lazarus is dead," then added something strange in verse 15, "And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." Glad? How could he be glad his friend died? Because Jesus saw beyond death. He saw an opportunity for glory that healing couldn't provide. A healed Lazarus would have been wonderful. A resurrected Lazarus would be unforgettable. When Jesus finally arrived at Bethany, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. This detail matters. Jewish belief held that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days, hoping to return. By the 4th day, decomposition made identity uncertain, and all hope of natural recovery vanished. Jesus deliberately waited until resurrection was humanly impossible. Martha heard Jesus was coming and went out to meet him, while Mary stayed home in her grief. Martha's first words in verse 21 expressed both faith and frustration. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She quickly added in verse 22, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus' response in verse 23 seemed simple. "Your brother will rise again." Martha assumed he meant the distant future, replying in verse 24, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." But Jesus wasn't talking about someday. His declaration in verses 25 and 26 redefined everything. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? Martha's confession in verse 27 was complete. "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." When Mary finally came to Jesus, she fell at his feet with the exact same words Martha had used. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Two sisters, same pain, same confusion about the delay. Verse 33 tells us that when Jesus saw Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek word suggests anger, not just sadness. Jesus was angry at death itself, at the pain it caused his friends, at the enemy's temporary victory. Then comes the shortest verse in the Bible, but one of the most powerful, verse 35. Jesus wept. The Creator cried at creation's brokenness. The resurrection wept at a tomb. He knew he was about to raise Lazarus, but he still grieved with those who grieved. When they reached the tomb, Jesus gave a command that seemed cruel. Verse 39, "Take away the stone." Martha, ever practical, protested, "But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Jesus' response in verse 40 called her back to faith. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" They removed the stone. Jesus prayed aloud, not for power to raise the dead, but thanking the Father for hearing him. He wanted everyone to understand that what was about to happen came from heaven, not human ability. Then, in verse 43, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" Someone once noted that if Jesus hadn't specified Lazarus, every tomb in that cemetery would have emptied. His voice carries the authority to wake the dead. Verse 44 describes the impossible sight. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Picture it, a mummy shuffling out of a dark tomb, still wrapped in grave clothes. Jesus had to give one more command: take off the grave clothes and let him go. Lazarus was alive, but he needed help getting free from death's wrappings. Sometimes resurrection comes instantly, but freedom comes through community. The same people who mourned him now unwrapped him. The delay that seemed cruel produced a miracle that healing couldn't match. Mary and Martha wanted their brother healed. Jesus wanted him resurrected. They wanted to avoid grief. Jesus wanted to destroy death's power. They said, "If only you had been here." Jesus showed them he's Lord even when he's not there. Many believed in Jesus because of this miracle, but it also sealed his fate with the religious leaders. John chapter 11 verse 53 tells us, "So from that day on, they plotted to take his life." The miracle that gave Lazarus back his life would cost Jesus his own, at least temporarily. 4 days in the tomb became the bridge to eternal life. The sisters' confusion became testimony. Their "if only" became God's glory. Sometimes Jesus delays, not because he doesn't care, but because he's planning something so much greater than what we're asking for. The Apostle Paul had seen the third heaven. He'd been caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 2 through 4, describe this extraordinary experience that happened 14 years before he wrote about it. He'd kept this secret for over a decade, only revealing it when forced to defend his apostleship. But with great revelation came great testing. Verse 7 explains, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me." We don't know what this thorn was. Some think it was an eye problem, others suggest a speech impediment, still others believe it was opposition from enemies. Paul deliberately kept it vague, perhaps so anyone with any thorn could relate. What matters isn't the thorn's identity, but its purpose, to keep Paul humble despite extraordinary revelations. This wasn't a minor irritation. The Greek word for thorn means a stake, something that pierces deeply. The word torment literally means to strike with fists, to beat repeatedly. This was ongoing, painful, and seemingly pointless suffering for someone serving God so faithfully. Paul did what any believer would do. He prayed for its removal. Verse 8 tells us, "3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me." 3 times. Not casual mentions, but earnest pleading. The man who had healed others couldn't get healing for himself. The apostle who had raised the dead couldn't get relief from his own affliction. 3 times he asked, and 3 times the answer was no. But the third no came with an explanation that would transform Paul's understanding of strength and weakness. Verse 9 records the Lord's response. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God didn't say, "My grace will help you endure until I remove this." He said, "My grace is sufficient," present tense, continuous, complete. The thorn would stay, but grace would be greater. God's power wouldn't remove the weakness. It would be perfected through it. This answer revolutionized Paul's perspective. The rest of verse 9 shows his transformation. "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." The Greek word for rest means to pitch a tent, to tabernacle. Paul's weakness became the tent where God's power set up residence. His thorn became the throne for God's strength. Verse 10 takes this even further. "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul didn't just accept his thorn, he delighted in it. Not in the pain itself, but in what the pain produced. A constant dependence on God's grace, a continual display of God's power, a compelling testimony that strength isn't found in human ability, but in divine sufficiency. This revelation about weakness and strength shaped everything Paul wrote. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29, he explained, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." Paul's thorn taught him that God's kingdom operates on different principles than the world's. The world says, "Eliminate weakness." God says he'll empower through weakness. The world says, "Project strength." God says, "Boast in weakness." The world says thorns are problems. God says thorns are platforms for power. Think about how this thorn affected Paul's ministry. When he stood before kings and governors, they saw a man who wasn't physically impressive, but spoke with heaven's authority. When he planted churches, people saw that the power wasn't in the messenger, but in the message. When he performed miracles, everyone knew it wasn't Paul's strength at work. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, Paul wrote from experience, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." Paul had asked for removal of the thorn. God gave him sufficient grace instead. Paul had imagined relief from suffering. God gave him power through suffering. Paul wanted the thorn gone. God wanted the thorn to become a throne for his glory. The 3 prayers weren't wasted. Each one drove Paul deeper into understanding grace. The first prayer might have been desperate. The second, persistent. The third, surrendered. By the end, Paul understood that some blessings come wrapped in thorns. This principle transformed how Paul saw every hardship. When he was imprisoned, he wrote letters that would guide the church for millennia. When he was beaten, he sang hymns that shook prison foundations. When he was shipwrecked, he evangelized islands. Every weakness became a stage for God's strength. Paul's thorn never left, but it never defeated him either. Instead, it became his strange friend, the thing that kept him dependent on God, humble in success, and powerful in weakness. He learned that answered prayer isn't always getting what we ask for. Sometimes it's discovering that what God gives instead is immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine. The thorn that seemed like Satan's messenger became God's megaphone. The weakness that seemed like a liability became Paul's greatest asset. The prayer that seemed unanswered became the key to understanding grace. 3 times Paul asked for the thorn's removal. Once God answered with something better, himself. If this message encouraged your heart today, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss our next biblical reflection. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that their blessing is not lost. It's just in God's perfect timing. Remember, your breakthrough might be just one day away. Keep believing, keep praying, and keep trusting. God's timing is always perfect.